Welcome back to another episode of Strength in the Details. Hi, Steph. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm awesome. I'm really excited to have you back on the show. You're no stranger to Strength in the Details podcast. It's been a little bit over a year since I think the last time we chatted about all things strength and nutrition. So, really excited to have you back on and thank you so much for your time.
Of course, it's a huge honor, and anytime I can sit down and talk about how we get stronger, it's kind of my love language. So I'm glad to be back.
Awesome. For those that may not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about you and who you are and in your background in strength training and nutrition.
Yeah. So I'm a sports nutritionist and a strength coach, and I've been strength training on myself since 2010. So I first kind of walked into a gym then, and eventually, long story short, ended up changing my career from high school science educator to what I do now. And I help people through a variety of means to really mesh the two worlds of how to lift weights and get stronger, particularly focusing on women over 40, but then also the fueling element and kind of performance nutrition element that goes along with that. So that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis, is talk about all things strength training, muscle, how we eat to support those goals. And, that's kind of what I do every day on the internet, which is a fun job to have.
That's awesome. We are trying to normalize women having muscle because it's so important. And I think, we'll get into this, but I think the narrative has kind of shifted finally about, the idea and the importance of muscle. But let's start with the basics. I
Mhm.
believe that strength training has finally it's getting its just due as not only an important component of health and fitness, but as a critical component of health and fitness. From your perspective, why is strength training important for the athlete across the lifespan?
Yeah, this is a great question. And when we look at, if we're talking about athletic folks, we're looking at things like not only sports performance, but longevity of tissues, longevity in the sport itself. How do we mitigate injury risk? We make these people more durable. Then resistance training to some degree is going to have to play a part in that, ideally. And I think there's now more of a shift to embracing this idea. It's sort of was back in the day, people would say, and I came from an endurance background. I used to run half marathons and marathons. I used to do endurance distance mountain biking and triathlons. And I was not strength training throughout any of that except right at the end. And it was kind of unusual to see cyclists at that point strength training. Maybe unless you were a track cyclist and you were trying to get jacked quads and you were kind of in that strength almost element of cycling, but I was in the endurance aspect of cycling, which everybody
Mhm.
at the time was like, just be light, just be small, don't put on too much muscle, stay tiny so you can push yourself, pedal yourself uphill really fast. And so I think it was less common to see, especially in the more recreational side of things, people being encouraged to lift weights along with or to resistance train along with their main sport. And then how do we combine those two things potentially across a year to look at that periodization, maybe when it's a competitive season or an off season. But I'm starting to see things changing now. So I'm seeing way more runners embracing resistance training, all sorts of different sports, as we keep an eye to, I think, longevity as well, not just in the sport, but as we're aging. And I mentioned earlier, I tend to work with people over 40. So there are a lot of people who are realizing now, hey, I want to continue running or whatever your sport is that you really love. I want to continue doing that for as long as I can. And gosh, I'm starting to see some declines in some of these areas. Maybe I'm losing power, maybe I'm losing strength, maybe I'm losing some of my speed, maybe I'm noticing I'm
Mhm.
more prone to injury and those sorts of
Mhm.
things. So turning an eye toward resistance training and how it can be a useful adjunct to whatever your main sport is, to not only just kind of maintain but help you improve in that main sport.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that perspective because I too see and speak with folks who are maybe transitioning out of a competitive sport atmosphere or structured sport atmosphere where maybe they have a structured program set up for them, and they're wondering, how do I maintain that across, now, maybe starting a family, starting a career, living life in our circumstances and our seasons change. And so I think it's important to understand that. And one of the things that I really admire about the content that you put out is that strength training is for everyone at any point in life and across the lifespan, regardless of whether you are a competitive elite level athlete or whether you're, doing the job of, a corporate executive or a stay-at-home mom. Like, it's important in all of those realms. What are you noticing about the way strength or resistance training is being promoted to women?
Mm, yeah, I think, oh, this is such a good question. Let me organize my thoughts briefly here. I think we're seeing less of the tiny pink dumbbells are the only thing women should be lifting. I am definitely seeing more women in the strength sections of the gym. For example, this past summer, our Jiu-Jitsu Academy, which is normally where I lift by myself, we had our some construction happening. And so I went to the local 24-hour fitness, which I hadn't been to one in over a decade. And when I
Hmm.
walked in, I was pleasantly surprised at how many women were occupying the platforms, the free weight area. I mean, it was awesome to see that instead of only women on the cardio equipment, which is kind of, I think, what we would see 10, 20, 30 years ago, those sorts of things. And I think there's more of an emphasis now on how do we lift appropriately, how to get enough stimulus, and those sorts of things. It's definitely creeping in to more to the mainstream, and I think that that's awesome because when I started lifting in 2010, it was people kind of thought we were freaks. We weren't bodybuilders, and so people were like, "Well, what are you doing?" We're kind of Olympic lifting and powerlifting together and those sorts of things, and pulling elements of those different types of training. I think the one thing I see a lot of confusion about, and perhaps we're going to talk about this today, is that not all training that involves resistance. So, for example, dumbbells, kettlebells, free weights, or even machines to some degree, not all lifting that incorporates that is designed to help you work on strength itself. And so I think there's a lot of confusion around these topics where a lot of people think, well, I am training with weights, but maybe I'm doing more circuit type training or hit type training that involves dumbbells or a barbell or something of that nature. But the intended stimulus of that workout might be metabolic conditioning, or it might
Hmm.
be to get more of that muscular endurance effect. Not that those things are bad or wrong, but when we do have that aspect of, especially as we're aging, wanting to preserve our ability to produce force, to move quickly, those sorts of things, work our type 2 fibers, we have to include some degree of those heavier loads, fewer repetitions with more rest in between. And that's where I think
Hmm.
some of the confusion is coming in, insofar as anytime you lift a weight, it's not automatically designed to work max force production. And I'm not
Right.
sure how we communicate that to the wider world, where there are a lot of women who are stoked that now they're just picking up some kind of weights, which is great. But then how do we move people further on through the continuum that says this workout that you're doing for with intervals, even though you're lifting a weight, may not have the same effect, especially if you're not a novice anymore, right? We have those
Right.
novice gains. We might see strength coming up concurrently, but there might be a cap on what you can develop in terms of max force production if you're doing those sorts of workouts. So I think that's sort of what I'm seeing, is a more refined discussion of what are the different forms of resistance training and what are the
Hmm.
benefits of those, quite frankly.
Yeah.
For example, too, if we're looking at women over 40, or we're just kind of considering all humans after around the age of 30 may start to see a decline in muscle mass. How do we then build muscle mass? What are the rep and set ranges and relative loads? What's the ballpark that's going to help us to develop some hypertrophy, right?
Mhm.
Some muscle gain. So I think, and I'm hoping we're going to start seeing a more finessed conversation about different types of resistance training on how you can develop kind of a nice Swiss Army knife of different protocols, or just understanding how to use these different types of training in your overall um, training plan to experience the benefits of all of those.
Yeah. Well said. And I what it made me think about was, why is it really challenging to find the most appropriate combination, right? Because there are times where I'll grab some dumbbells, I'm short on time, and I will put together a little circuit because, hey, today is about moving my body. But when you talk about hypertrophy and resistance training and some of the benefits that we're looking for, it does require a very intentional focus on not only just grabbing, some resistance or, body weight or whatever, but there is a focus on, how many reps, how many sets, how much rest, how much fuel we'll need to support that. And some of the things that come to mind that I'd love to hear your perspective on is I think that we have to address safety. You know, if you're more of a novice exerciser, what are some of the safety things that we should be looking at? And then confidence to do, you know, these heavier loads. Self-efficacy is another thing that comes into mind. But how would you help someone, one, understand, some of the safety aspects, and then others, how would you help them build confidence behind, this idea of heavier lifting?
Yeah, I love this question. And I also come from a USA weightlifting background. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've ever taken away from my time as a USA weightlifting certified coach and coaching Olympic weightlifters in the gym and working with my mentor coach was, how do we mitigate the risk of injury, and how do we keep an eye on safety as something that's really important? And I think when we pull back and look at the bigger picture, if somebody's pretty new to the idea of strength training and they have the means and resources, my first recommendation is always going to be that they work with someone in person, even if it's a short amount of time or it's a few sessions, just to gain some situational awareness of the gym itself, the layout of the land, what's the different equipment, and all the things that, frankly, those of us with experience take for granted. For example, how do you safely load and unload a barbell? The number of
Hmm.
times I've seen a barbell go flying off the rack because it was unloaded one side at a time. And these are kind of the unspoken things that we don't always learn. How do you properly lap a set of dumbbells if you're going to do some dumbbell bench presses? I mean, these are really tiny things that we just kind of take for granted that people know or don't know. But I think if you have the means, working with somebody in person is going to take you a long way into looking at some basic assessments of your movement, seeing where you might need to bring some things up in terms of your capacity, starting out with a training plan that's realistic and not going to smack you over the head with volume. And I see this a lot with newer people. They are tending to be sometimes a little bit more shy of picking up heavier weights, and heavy is relative, but what they sometimes will do is, logically, it makes sense. I think, okay, I should just do body weight or really tiny weights for a lot of reps. And then they end up with DOMs, and then they say, this is so painful. Why would anybody do this? And I'm not doing this again. So, working with somebody in person, I think, even if it's for a short amount of time, can give you the lay of the land of the equipment, give you some general pointers, have somebody looking at your form and technique and spotting any places where it might be appropriate for you to do some modifications to a particular exercise. And, you as being, again, a USA weightlifting coach, and, you know, you'll understand that. And then for anybody who's listening who has that experience, we don't always just start somebody with a snatch. We want to see, can they actually hold the weight over their head? Can they get into a full squat? And if they can't, then we're going to, modify the movements to build them up to having that mobility, that stability, that strength in order to support a barbell overhead, because that's a pretty technical and taxing movement. So I think that that's an important part. And that helps to also underscore the safety element. Um, I think there's also a little bit of misunderstanding about, for example, what can cause, in my audience in particular, we hear a lot of people talking about, my joints get really irritated. We know that estrogen and the shifting of estrogen can contribute to things like joint irritation, inflammation, slower repair of tissues, tissue stiffness, and those sorts of things. And so when we're thinking about that, it's like, if we're going to do a million repetitions of something, even if it's light, that could contribute to, the increase in volume, making our joints feel a little bit more sensitive or irritated. So sometimes it's just not even in understanding how we would approach training. And maybe it is finding that moderate weight, but something that feels challenging for the last couple of reps. I know that a lot of people are really keen on perfect technique, but I mean, I've seen people do all sorts of squats based on their anatomy and what their flexibility and mobility will allow, where it might not look like a textbook picture, but that's okay. The
Mhm.
person is squatting in a way that's mitigating risk and is safe to the point that we can make it safe for them. And so I think sometimes we get a little bit too focused on what is perfect technique, knowing that somebody who's newer is going to have an immature squat. And
Mhm.
again, is a back squat with a barbell appropriate for somebody when they're first coming in? It might not be. It might be a goblet squat or a front squat or something of that nature, even a body weight squat for a little while, but then, we'll build up over time. So there's obviously a lot there. And I think that, again, if somebody can work with a coach or at least have some guidance from a trainer or something, they're probably going to have the smoothest entry point. Um,
Mhm.
and also, the big picture, not when my lifters come in and are doing my templated program, we're not starting out with heavy triples,
Right.
especially in those main lifts. We're starting out building capacity first. And
Mhm.
yes, we want to get people to the point of lifting challenging loads in those strength ranges and those sorts of things, but we have to earn the right to do that. And we have to build up that tissue integrity. We have to build up the mobility, the stability. Um, Everybody talks about plyometrics and why plyometrics are awesome for people over 40 and women in menopause. And I'm like, yeah. And if you haven't been very active, and even if you have been active, you haven't been loading your tissues, learning how to decelerate safely, you haven't been working on landing mechanics, going out and trying to do just some max height box jumps or box jump repeats might be more than your tissues can handle, first and foremost. So we're going to start off by building the capacity to land properly, absorb force, build elasticity and stiffness in the tissues that we need. And then eventually you'll get to the point potentially of box jumping, but we're not going to start
Right.
everybody there.
Right.
So I think, when we deliver that message to the general public, yes, I'm trying to think about, what do we want as the components of that program to include that would make a well-rounded program for somebody that's going to work with me, but we're not going to necessarily start everybody there. And how we build up and we progress over time is incredibly important. So yes, we're talking about lifting heavy, but that might not be where you start, and it's all relative. So you might be squatting 200 pounds, and for you that's I don't know, an RPE 7, and for somebody else
Mhm.
that would be RPE 10 plus. They're not even going to be able to squat that yet. So
Yeah.
that is where programs that work off of a subjective scale or reps in reserve, RPE, something of that nature, or just having somebody watching you and saying, you know what, I don't know, form's really breaking down on that, like, let's take the weight down and focus on moving well first. So
Yeah. Well,
lots to
thank you so
consider.
much for that. Definitely lots to consider, and I definitely think that people should have that in the back of their brain. This is the new year. Everyone is really excited to get started on their journey, get started with strength training. And, I visited a box gym recently when I was visiting family. And I noticed that people, more women, athletic women were in the weight section, and it made my heart smile. Not everyone has great quality form. but I think there's something to be said for getting started, for starting. That's the first step. And I think so many people are afraid of starting for fear of failure that may not even come, in the beginning. So what do you say to people who have accepted that, yes, strength training is great for me. I know that it's beneficial, but I just don't know where to get started, um, from a kind of a jumping into a new program standpoint.
So if they're a bit nervous and they don't know where to jump in terms of a program, I think it's worth doing some self-reflection and thinking about what kind of person you tend to be. Are you somebody who can follow an app or a program or something of that nature, and you've got the rest of your schedule down and you know where you can fit it in? Or are you somebody who knows yourself well enough to know that in the past you've tried other things, like, some $7 a month app, and it's kind of sat on your phone without a lot of love. It hasn't been used very much because you keep kind of getting stuck on the same things, right? So maybe life gets lifey, maybe you got sick or something happened or just got really busy and you weren't sure how to make that fit into your life. And or maybe it was something along the lines of some all or nothing thinking getting in the way, thinking, oh, I wanted to do 7 days a week and I missed a day. I'm going to have to go all the way back to the beginning, those sorts of things. So I think when you're starting out and you're thinking about what kind of learner are you, what kind of follow through and support might you need, that can help guide you in terms of what you choose. I know there are a lot of people who are super self-directed. They just don't want to talk to anyone. They want to put on their headphones, get in the gym, just bang out their sets. They want to be in their own world. They don't need any kind of accountability. That's just how they are. And they find that particular styles of lifting programs work really well for them. They don't need to ask a coach anything. They're very confident on their own. Maybe they're a bit more experienced versus someone who
Mhm.
is newer. And some of the, yes, of course, there can be questions about how do you execute the exercises? Do you need any substitutions? What does a superset mean? Certain things in the program itself. But beyond that, it's in those softer skills. It is in how do I overcome obstacles? What happens if something goes wrong with my training? How do I work around the challenges that I know have come up for me in the past? And what kind of
Mhm.
supports do I need? We know that social support is so important in behavior change and
Mhm.
environments and so on and so forth. So that can be, I think, where um, finding a program at a local strength and conditioning facility that will meet your needs of, hey, I love that community interaction and knowing that and Naja is there and she's waiting for me is just, I'm going to go, I'm going to show up because
Yeah.
I like her and I feel like I've got some connection and community. So if that matters to you, cool. If you really want to work with a coach online and have somebody there because you know that sometimes you get in your own head about things and you get a little bit dichotomous with your thinking, or sometimes you get into that fixed mindset mode and I know that I need to focus on growth and approaching things differently. I'll give you an example. One of my clients, I was so I was watching her notes and reading through her notes in her app, and she was talking about how, she had a family visit to Alaska over the holidays and she works as a nanny, and her schedule for her nannying went really kind of wonky on her. And I
Mhm.
was so proud of the fact that she could kind of resume when she did what she could when she was away and life got lifey, and then she just resumed with her training. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. What allowed you to do that? And she said, I've learned a lot from the past that if I let all of the imperfections get to me, then I either get so stressed out that I get little benefit from my training because I am so stressed, I feel terrible, or I've
Right.
overdone it in the past and I haven't learned how to incorporate things like auto regulation. I've just tried to push
Mhm.
through because it was on the plan. So she really learned that taking that advice from her coaches and putting that into practice in the past helped her in the present. So I really think it depends on the kind of person you are and how you tend to operate. And if you know that you've tried to do fitness before, tried to do a strength plan before, joined the gym before, and it hasn't worked out, ask yourself what there is to learn from that about yourself, not in a judgy way, but sort of a, where are my opportunities for growth and what kind of supports do I probably need to be successful? There is no one right way to do it. And I think that that's where, if we could help folks find their option. For example, I refer out a ton to a friend of mine who does Zoom, one-on-one Zoom based virtual strength training,
Hmm.
where she will meet with a person one-on-one over Zoom and they do the workout basically together.
Right.
That's great. That's not something I offer. So I always think about, if I know somebody is looking for that, I've got somebody I can refer to. And I think the more we can do that and help guide people toward what they're needing the most, that's going to help them be more successful.
I love that. Referrals, like my network, thankful to social media for this element of my business. Not all elements, but this element, I feel like I have so many connections through social media. And similarly, I'm not afraid to refer someone to a professional that is qualified and able to support what they need. I'm not for everyone. My services are not for everyone. My personality is not for everyone, and I think that you have to realize that as a coach and as a consumer, as an athletic person looking for help and coaching, that just because they are a coach, it may not be the coach for you. And I think that that's also important from a
Mhm.
referral standpoint. There's so many ways that we can strength train, and I don't know. I'm not going to speak for you, but there's something about having a barbell in my hands that just really transcends, a lot of things for me. It really elevates my mood, my spirit. I say that it's my spirit animal. I love barbell work, but it can seem intimidating. Could you talk about maybe your transition into barbell sport, Olympic weightlifting, and then maybe recommendations for athletes who maybe they didn't embrace barbell or barbell sports as a younger person? What can they do to get involved in the sport across, the lifespan?
Mhm. Are we speaking about specifically Olympic lifting or powerlifting or just using a
Yeah,
barbell
Olympic
in
lift,
general?
probably Olympic lifting. Yeah,
So I first started learning how to lift free weights in 2010. As I mentioned, I joined a CrossFit gym, and prior to that was doing my endurance sport stuff. Ironically, now I do both. I do some, cardio and endurance, not true like long endurance stuff, but I also lift weights. So I've I have this really weird full circle thing that's happened with me, where now I started running again last year and I'm really enjoying it. So long story short, I joined the CrossFit gym and I learned how to lift free weights. I had dabbled here and there in all sorts of stuff. And when I say all sorts of stuff, I mean, I used to in my living room do Denise Austin workouts. I would do the firm, which was like the weighted stick. I have done
yeah.
all sorts of group X classes. I mean, you name it. I've done everything, but I had never properly learned how to lift barbells. And having a smaller environment like a CrossFit class really did help me. I mean, I went through the on-ramp program and I learned the basics, and I was lucky insofar as our class sizes were pretty small. And you are shout out to Rick Santa Maria at CrossFit Chula Vista, because they are great there at teaching people and really making sure that people don't fall through the cracks. And I had a really great experience there learning how to barbell lift. And
Mhm.
that was a whole new world, because if you stick with it long enough, you get past the beginner weirdness of learning anything new. And, fairly soon you start to notice that you get that like lovely novice gains phase where you're increasing your weights fairly often and hitting PRs like every week. And there's just something about the barbell that's really powerful, because it allows you to some degree lift a little bit heavier than you could with just dumbbells alone. I mean, I've tried to get 70-pound dumbbells up to my shoulders and do like dumbbell squats, and it's pretty awkward. So, to some degree, using a barbell for certain lifts can help you to lift a bit heavier. And there was just something about that that like poked a part of my brain that was like, ooh, this is awesome because I finally feel strong. I finally feel like I'm getting stronger. And I previous like to that in my life, even as an athletic person who had been in sports since the age of 7, I never felt strong. I never thought I could do push-ups and pull-ups, and I just never thought I could climb a rope. I mean, are you kidding me? I just was like, this is never going to happen. So that really poked that part of my brain that said, if you can do this, what else? What else is on the table for you? So
Yeah.
I think that that's where that started. And then as I got more familiar with CrossFit and started learning the Olympic lifts, and I was lucky to have some great teachers there as well, I eventually left, training specifically for competitive CrossFit. At the time, I moved overseas and I was with my fiance, now husband, living in Scotland and launching my fledgling business in 2013. And the competitive level of training for the competitive CrossFit that I was doing, along with the stress of starting a new business and living in a new country, I looked at my husband and I said, I think this will kill me. I don't know if that I can recover from this. So I started only lifting squat, bench, deadlift, press, just kind of defaulting to more of a basic barbell lift program. And then when we got back to the States the next year, I connected with my old Oli coach who I had met through CrossFit, and he had his own gym at the time. And so I went and started lifting the Olympic lifts. And that's really how I got more experience with basically doing snatch, clean, and jerk, and then the accessory lifts that go with that. So I spent a few years, competing. I spent some time coaching there as well, and it was great. Um, I think, from the perspective of somebody who's coming in and they haven't learned how to barbell lift yet, and maybe they're intimidated. I mean, I think when we see in the general sense of things, maybe you're watching YouTube and you're watching clips of the Olympics and you see these people lifting just ridiculously heavy amounts of weight, and they're doing it fast, and everybody from teeny tiny humans to very big humans, and the barbells are massive, and they're, straining to stand up, and then it's so exciting and thrilling to watch. But for a lot of people, they think, am I going to have to do that when I go?
Yeah.
I can't do, right? They don't always see the grandmas who are doing it. They don't see the young kids who are doing it, and understand that it's a journey. Not not everybody's going to get to that level. But I think, again, if you can have some coaching or instruction, there are some things with more technical lifting like Olympic lifting and the like, that the more you can focus in on these technique pieces. Because if we put a 30 kg bar on the ground and said, hey, can you just get this to your shoulders, a lot of people would be able to kind of muscle it up to their shoulders
Yeah.
if they had some basic strength training. But to do it well, and is the pursuit of Olympic lifting, it is literally trying to perfect. I guess we could call it two lifts: snatch and clean and jerk. So you're trying to perfect these two things,
Mhm.
and the technique. And when it's done well, it's possible to do it not well.
Yes.
You're only going to be able to
Yes.
get so far. So I think when you're considering, if you do want to learn the Olympic lifts and you have some desire to just do it for training, for sport carryover. Do I think everybody, for example, I'll use jujitsu as an example because I'm in that world too, but does everybody who's a jujitsu athlete need to do snatches from the ground? Probably not. Could a lot of people stand to do some variation of a power clean for power development? Probably.
Hmm.
So how do we help people apply that in a way that makes sense for sport? But if you're looking to really get deep into the world of Olympic lifting, um, you may be able to take it some distance on your own, but you're going to get to a point where you really need that coach's eye. And it also just takes a lot of time and practice. So if
Yes.
you're doing it once every couple weeks, it's probably not going to be enough if you want that to be your main pursuit. you want to become an Olympic lifter and do it recreationally or competitively at some level, you're going to need to kind of center most of your training on that. And,
Hmm.
your conditioning or whatnot can be on the side, but it takes a lot of repetition and a lot of technique work because you've got to move the bar in a very specific way, and adding the speed to it is
Yeah.
a whole other element to deal with.
It's interesting. I caught myself scrolling back on my own timeline from when I first started Olympic weightlifting and had the audacity to post those videos. It was really quite interesting to go back to see where I started and, where I am almost 8 years later, of being in the sport, both as an athlete and a coach, instill in athletes, especially beginners, right? This is a journey, and everybody's journey is going to be different, and everyone is going to respond differently to different programming. But if you fall in love with the process of learning the Olympic lifts, they can be so rewarding. I mean, there's something to be said about having a heavy barbell above your head at the end of a snatch or a clean and jerk. As a woman, as an athlete, it has made me feel so powerful in so many different ways, and I think that's the part that is so thrilling and so rewarding, because at the end of the day, like you
Hmm.
said, you're essentially perfecting two lifts, and you're spending hours training these two lifts and that's it.
Hmm.
And so there has to be some other part of that you find joy and reward from. So
Yeah, 100%.
I'd love to talk a little bit about something that is new to me, but that I see you promote a lot on your social media. I want to talk about rucking. What
Mm.
is it? What are the benefits of it? And maybe how does that complement a strength routine, if at all?
Yeah, great question. So the original, well, let's put it this way: humans have been carrying things since we first probably walked upright. But the more modern sense, or the more modern term of rucking, comes from the military, which is carrying a rucksack full of all of your equipment that you need. And the more recreational kind of sport aspect of rucking now is based on that, which is carrying heavy load over distance. And I like to bring that up because I'm a huge fan of load carries in training, but there's a difference
Mhm.
between, say, taking a heavy farmer carry down the gym and back or something like that versus putting a weighted backpack or a weight vest on and walking for a few miles or more.
Mhm.
So it's a different kind of carrying. It's not necessarily going to, again, help you build max strength, but there is
Right.
some incredible benefit to it. I think one of the biggest ones, and I just wrote about this today, we have this kind of clash sometimes, it seems like, between, and we've talked about this kind of off air, right? We have our minimum exercise guidelines. So we've got our strength training minimums, we've got our cardiovascular minimums, and that's going to be 150 minutes of moderate intensity cardio or 75 minutes of vigorous cardio, or a combination of the both of those as the minimum that we want to shoot for.
Mhm.
We also have a lot of people who are like 10,000 steps a day, 10,000 steps a day, get your steps in, get your steps in. And frankly, I've seen people on the internet telling women that they need to be doing 15 to 20K steps a day. And while I think that's shoot for the moon if you have that time freedom and you just love it, but that's not going to be practical for most people I know. So I think there's a big clash going on right now between, what do I prioritize? Do I prioritize my step count, which we know for a lot of people ends up being inclusive of NEAT as well? Or do I
Mhm.
prioritize cardio? And I think that rucking presents an interesting opportunity to work on your step count.
Mhm.
And when you carry weight, you make it a little bit easier to get into those moderate intensity heart rate zones like zone 2, that can have a lot of benefit in terms of capillary density, mitochondrial function, so on and so forth, that really give us that aerobic base. So in other words, I think one of the unique benefits of something like a load carry, like rucking or wearing a weight vest, is that you can go out and get your steps. And we know that there's so much mental health benefit to that too. I love a walk and, just getting outdoors. But it also kind of kills two birds with one stone because you're carrying more weight. That's going to drive your heart rate up higher than if you were just walking the same course without that weight. And yes, you can, walk on a treadmill or only walk up hills and get that grade. That's going to get your heart rate up a little bit. But not everybody has that around. I live in San
Right.
Diego. It's pretty darn flat here. And, you could walk real fast, but not everybody has the capacity to do that pace that's really going to help you walk quickly and get your heart rate up. So we do have that unique cardio benefit because we're just having to schlep more weight across distance. Potentially there could be some bone density benefit as well. You're loading the axial skeleton. So that's interesting. And I would love to see more research on this. I know that there's a little bit of research about loaded carrying for women in postmenopause and potential
Hmm.
benefits for things like bone density. So that's cool.
Hmm.
Definitely a social element to it as well, if you desired. So, I used to be a cyclist, as I mentioned, and I would go on group rides and I would be riding with these like 6'3" guys who are just these tanks. And I'm 5'3". I would get shot off the back of the pace line and have to try to catch up. And there would be nothing social about that kind of thing. So rucking is cool because we could each be wearing a weight that's challenging for us, but we're still walking
Hmm.
along at the same pace. So that's a cool one as well. And then just in terms of building postural strength, those muscles that can kind of counteract a little bit of that forward posture that we get just by living our modern lives. So when you're rucking, you have to kind of maintain that upright posture. So that can be a nice benefit as well to strengthen those muscles, a little bit more of a muscular endurance effect. Sometimes people will say, hey, rucking can help make you stronger. And I always remind them that's not the same as doing your heavy back squats or your heavy deadlifts. So don't forget to do your heavy squats and your heavy deadlifts. But it can help in terms of muscular endurance to build
Hmm.
that strength over time and potentially for things like a particular career that you may do. So if you're someone who wears a weight vest for your career or you have to carry a pack for your career, training with a ruck can help. For example, one of my students is in the wildlife or environmental ecology field. And so she quite oftentimes has to hike out into this Sierra here in California to test things like water levels. And so she's
Hmm.
hiking with a pack all the time. So somebody like that training with a ruck from time to time, especially in your off season, can help you build up that strength for having to carry load that goes along with your job.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of interesting benefits. And it's fun. It's fun to get out there and challenge yourself in that way.
Yeah. We love a good outdoor adventure. And I think
Yeah.
that's what originally caught my attention. I'm like, I could be outdoors. I could, carry this weighted vest, and it doesn't have to be high, um, high impact to be effective, meaning
Right.
like jumping and plyometrics are great and we love them, but that may not be accessible to everyone. And I
Mhm.
think that this is a nice way to, get that cardiovascular and metabolic conditioning benefit with a low impact option that allows you to get outside. And I think that's a great complement for strength training in general, for athletes as a cross training mechanism. Like
Mhm.
not every day has to be a squat, a bench, a deadlift, and a press. Some days need to be those cross training activities. And I think that might be a great addition to that. And so I'll make sure that I include some information in the show notes for that, for people that might be interested in pursuing that.
Yeah, definitely. And I would echo what you said there about the impact, it being lower impact than running. It's not a no impact activity, but
Right.
also I know folks, and I come again from the cycling world, who would do, no impact activity whatsoever. And if it is accessible to you, that's important, right? It's important to do weight bearing exercise and also to have some degree of impact in your training to help your bones stay strong. So avoiding impact altogether, especially if there's no contraindications for that, you might not be a runner or you might not want to run and think this is torture and I'm not into it. But getting something like a ruck or a weight vest on can help you get some impact training without it being overly impactful on your joints.
One thing that I've noticed in our conversation as we're talking about strength training and resistance training and exercise in general is that the word weight loss has not come up.
Mm.
And I am so very thankful for that, because I do think that for a long time, and probably to some degree now, um, exercise is so closely associated with weight loss. You know, I exercise to lose weight. And I think for women folks and women athletes, that's largely been what's taught to us. You exercise to either lose or maintain a particular type of weight. Can you share your like top three reasons outside of weight loss that people should exercise and more specifically strength train?
Yeah, absolutely. So, number one, I would say, and again, this is kind of tailored to more or less who I work with, but we know now that the menopause transition itself, so the perimenopausal years where there's an up and down in hormones, and then we get to that 12 months without the menstrual period, and then you're postmenopausal for the rest of your life. We know that, of course, when we're 30, around our 30-year mark, the declines in things like muscle mass and bone density can begin, but there are some acceleration points in which there's rapid change. And one of those periods of rapid change is around that actual point of menopause happening and then living
Hmm.
your life as postmenopausal. So I think, in terms of offsetting some of the muscle loss that could occur if we do nothing, and or slowing down the rate of muscle loss, will we be able to maintain the muscle mass we had when we were 20, when we're in our 80s, without any pharmaceutical intervention? Probably not, but we can mitigate it to a large degree. So I would say that's number one. Why is that important? Because when we look at the association of, for example, muscle mass and longevity, we see a lot of positive associations with increased longevity. So, for example, can you get up and down off the floor? We know that's the sit to stand test. And so muscle mass and strength is very much related to that. And again, these are associations. I just want to be clear, there's a difference between correlation and causation, or association and direct cause. But we know that if people can get up and down off the floor, they tend to have better overall mobility and be able to participate in activities of daily life better. Um, when we're looking at our metabolic health and even things like blood sugar management, we know that once we're in our later years, as we're aging, and particularly we're going through the menopause transition, we may have an increased risk of things like insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. Again, especially in women, that can be an interesting change in the risk factors, tipping not in our favor. So
Hmm.
some of those things regarding exercise in general, but then of course, strength training, we know also has some really interesting metabolic effects. We used to think
Hmm.
cardiovascular exercise is the only thing that would help us, for example, with our mitochondrial density. There's some newer research that calls that into question and looks at the role of strength training potentially in helping with our metabolic markers, our ability to um, get those mitochondria um, upregulated, and so on and so forth. So I think when we're looking at those health factors and we're looking at lifestyle stuff, longevity, independence, decreasing the risk of fall, we know that the risk of fracture is incredibly high in women because of the increased likelihood that we may develop things like osteopenia or osteoporosis.
Hmm.
When combined with fall, of course you can break a bone without falling, or you can have a fracture without falling, but fall risk is incredibly high, especially as we're aging. And so can we strengthen our muscles so we reduce the risk of fall and potentially reduce the risk of fracture? So I think when we're looking at longevity, that's really important, and that's an important piece. And then also I'll touch on, and I know this is probably near and dear to your heart, but is how resistance training may help us with things like mild depression, anxiety. There's a mood and kind of um, mindset element to that, self-efficacy. And I know you can probably you've probably done your very in-depth podcast on that since it's your area of expertise. But I think a lot of people take that for granted, or they don't
Hmm.
highlight that enough, is exercise's role in general, but also strength training in particular for helping with things like mood, cognitive benefits, and
Hmm.
so on and so forth. So I think, if we expand out besides just, again, that narrow focus on weight loss and body size management and whatever we want to call it, I think we're missing the forest for the trees. And I know that, marketers are always like, what is the pain point I can solve for people? And what is the pain point that my audience is looking at? And this is a common one, but at the same time, can we help people to understand and embrace the changes and the positive benefits outside of just weight loss? Because I
Yeah.
think that if we can also help people to connect it to how does building physical strength, how does that bleed out into the rest of my life?
Yeah.
Do I want to be able to get up and down off the floor and play with the kids or the grandkids? Do I want to go hike? I had a client who was like, I want to go hike Mount Fuji. Great. Like, awesome bucket list item. Like, how are we going to help you build the strength for that? Um, so, when you feel stronger and you can get out of bed every day and maybe your body isn't hurting quite as much and you're able to just be present for the people that you love and feel like you're having a more, just a more present life experience. How do we, when we shrink it down to just being about weight loss, we completely miss that conversation. So
Yeah.
I appreciate very much your focus not on that as well. And sometimes I feel like I'm alone in the wilderness where I'm sort of like, we also have all this other stuff over here. Do you want this stuff too? This is great.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
I wholeheartedly agree. Wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
Um, I appreciate that, Steph. I appreciate you as always in everything that you're doing to communicate and fight the good fight. You're not in the wilderness alone. Although sometimes, sometimes you like yell out and you just hear echoes and you're like, okay. I wonder if anyone hears me. And I think I've changed my perspective. And I'm like, if one person can hear me, like if I can just reach one person, I feel like maybe that's the mentality that I have to take with this, because I feel like we are fighting what society is telling us as women, as athletes, why we should exercise, to shrink our bodies, to shrink the amount of space that we take. And weight loss is not a bad thing. Like, it is not, if weight loss is what you need, and if weight loss is what you desire, and if weight loss is going to make you feel more vibrant and healthy and thrive, like, let's do it. I'm all for it. But it's not the only thing, and it's not the only benefit.
Hmm.
And I think that's important.
Yeah,
Here on
absolutely.
Strength in the Details, we're all about going beyond the reps and sets and providing content and resources about things that people need to know. So before I let you go, what is your strength in the detail that you'd like to share for listeners?
Oh gosh. I think the biggest thing that I have seen be impactful for the most folks is being able to delineate different different timelines for why they're doing strength training. So for example, maybe you have a near-term goal, something that you want to work on. I don't know, hitting a particular back squat number or getting on an assisted pull-up or something like that. And those things are wonderful. And at the same time, I think how we also zoom out and look at the big picture is very, very important, because my goal is not to help people just engage in strength training for a blip and then be gone and think this
Right.
is not something I want to keep doing. My goal is, how do we help you do this for the rest of your life?
Right.
And that can be daunting, because when you say to somebody, well, it's not just about the next 6 weeks, it's about the next 50 years, they get a little bit deer in headlights. But I
Yeah.
think there's something very freeing in that, which is we have time. That's wonderful. But also, how do we stay engaged? How do we stay consistent in the process? So maybe there are different ways that fitness shows up for you or strength shows up for you in whatever season of life that you're in. Can you shift? Can you change tack? Can you continue to let that evolve for you? I don't do competitive Olympic weightlifting anymore at the moment, but I still engage in strength training in a way that helps me be better at jujitsu, helps me be a better, runner. And it's just, I love strength training. So I'm going to be in there doing my thing. But it's okay to shift and evolve. It's okay to let it look different in different seasons of your life. Maybe for some of you, right now, you're not in that competitive building to an event season of your life.
Mm-hmm.
You're just in the kind of like maintain and do minimums season of your life for whatever reason. And that's okay, right? That's okay. But it's like, how do you stay consistent to the idea, to just the process of letting strength training be in your life and letting it serve whatever purpose it needs to serve for you at that time, and letting yourself evolve. It's okay to change. If you're like, it ain't working for me anymore to do this particular gym or this class that I used to go to or whatever it happens to be, the great news is there's probably something out there for you that's a great fit for you right now. You just have to give yourself
Right.
the permission to evolve.
Right.
And it
Love
can
that.
be there
Thank you
with
so
you the
much.
rest of your life if you let it.
Thank you so much. How can
Sure.
people connect with you and learn more about what you offer?
You can find me on my website, stephgaudreau.com. The social media channel I'm on most is Instagram. So I'm at Steph_Gaudreau, and my podcast, Fuel Your Strength.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'll make sure I tag all of those things in the show notes. It was wonderful to connect with you again, and I look forward to sharing this with other people.
Thanks for having me back.